We'll start right away with introduction. If everyone can please share their name, where you are currently, and also what is your background, maybe what you do, how would you describe yourself? So I guess we would move on in order to maximize our time here today.
Yes, so welcome. I'm Bonnie Politz, and I'm championing this youth system strengthening community of practice with Victoria. And we wanted to just reintroduce our two speakers and jump right into their presentations. First, we're going to hear from Robyn Braverman, who is based in Honduras right now and has been doing incredible work with Proponte Mas. And Danielle Okpaise, who's in Nigeria, and will tell us more about OneAfricanChild and the system's work there. So we'll move on to the next slide. And Robyn, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Welcome, everyone. Just to frame this, this was a project in Honduras that was funded by USAID and ran from 2016 to 2020. Next slide. We looked at what we could do to reduce violence and increase protective factors amongst youth, but with a focus on building the family as a system. Our motto was La familia que hay, no la que hace falta, which basically means it's the family that is, not as the family that we kind of imagine. Next. So why Honduras? Why did we pick Honduras? Well, this was based on the fact that the national homicide rates in 2014 was at 86% per 100,000 residents. And in 2014, around 66 per 100,000 makes it one of the most dangerous countries in the world. And you can really bring that down and really focus on geo-specific areas, and that percentage went higher. And so what it meant was that it also had 4 of the 5 top municipalities with the crisis of unaccompanied children fleeing to the States. So together with that increase that we saw in 2014 of unaccompanied minors and the increase in homicides, the USAID mission decided to really look at how we could create a systems approach to look at violence prevention. I just want to also add that at this point, the homicide rates have gone down notably. However, we're still dealing with, from this country, a large exit of people fleeing for various reasons related to violence and corruption and the lack of trust in systems. Next. So what did we do? We wanted to use a family prevention model that would really look at reducing 9 empirically derived risk factors predictive of gang joining. We created a tool that was started by the University of Southern California and really focused on looking at risk factors in the city of Los Angeles. So we brought that tool and we contextualized it to Honduras, and we worked with kids between the ages of 8 to 17 in 5 municipalities across Honduras, where USAID had determined they were going to really focus their efforts on a place-based strategy. So these were urban areas, and within those urban areas, they were really high crime, high gang presence neighborhoods. So the results were at-risk youth would receive secondary prevention services in target communities. We would establish support services for eligible youth, establish a cadre of family counselors, strengthen alternative measures to detention for juvenile offenders, and establish the community-based prevention model. Next. So they really, in past, USAID has really focused on what are those primary prevention activities? And when we talk about that, we mean what kind of activities can we bring to communities for kids who are at lowest risk of anything? And that's really building the family cohesion. So that would be really strengthening community structures, community outreach centers, in football games, cultural activities, rehab of spaces that were meant for community gathering and really focused at youth. And I want to just stop and say, one of the interesting things about this intervention to keep in your framework is that this focused on a youth demographic of 8 to 17. So that's pretty big. You know, there's a pretty big age range there, which was really different for USAID in the past. So we looked at secondary prevention, which was really the target of this intervention, which we defined as youth who are at the door engaging in illicit activities. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then tertiary prevention, which was really youth who have self-reported engagement in illicit activities. So we used this tool, which started out as the Y set, developed in USC, as I said before, and we developed a new and contextualized tool based on that called the Instrument to Measure Behaviors, which measures now behaviors and protective factors, because we really wanted to look at the family system and see how we can increase the protective factors and reduce those risky factors that come either from in the family or from the environment outside. At the same time, as I said before, we focused it on the place-based strategy designed to create with USAID implementers a simultaneous program implementation so that we were all focusing our efforts, whether it be on access to justice services or employment or even counseling in the same municipalities. We wanted to address the 4 different types of at-risk populations, I'm sorry, 3 different types of at-risk populations, and blend it with local law enforcement efforts. While Proponte Mas did not directly deal with law enforcement, we did deal with the juvenile justice system and also with the protection system. Next. So this is just a map of where we worked. We worked in the main capital area, San Pedro Sula, which had the highest homicide rate in the world, Choloma, which is a neighboring bedroom community to San Pedro Sula, and the Garifuna communities of Tela and La Ceiba. Next. Bonnie?
Sorry, that was me. So yes, this is a, sorry, I'm trying to put my video back on. What happened? Technical glitch. Okay. We wanted to share this in each of our sessions we've been doing with the Youth Systems Strengthening Community of Practice. We've shared this framework, which a group I'm involved with called the Youth Systems Collaborative, which is comprised of about 9 international development organizations who do work globally and are typically competitors. We've come together to share what we're learning about focusing on systems change in all of our work across all sectors. And through that work, we did a huge research project. I think on our site, on the Youth Power site, there's a new article that was in the Global Journal of Youth Development, which recently came out talking more about the youth systems framework. But we came up with this framework to try and find a way for people to talk about the work they're doing, the lessons they're learning, the struggles they're having, but to try and build various scenarios and cases over time that we can learn from. So these are the aspects of what we have looked at in terms of the research from many different sources about what it takes to really change and address systems change and systems strengthening. So we've asked each of the presenters over the course of these events to use the framework to try and tell a bit of their story about the work they're doing to impact systems change. So I'll give it back to Robyn now.
Thank you, Bonnie. I wanted to use this, and I really appreciate that, because we wanted to look at how we built this family system. We wanted the youth to become healthy, engaged, and successful, and we wanted to show that these systems could support them through their multifaceted transitions. And so we really felt like, what better way to start strengthening these systems than through the family? And creating the family as the first protection system for youth is at the heart of this intervention. And using scientific evidence to demonstrate change was key to making this successful. So I want to take a pause right here before we go into the next slide and talk a little bit about what that looked like on the ground. So first, this was a pilot. So what that meant is that we did direct implementation in the first 2 years, whereby Proponte Mas itself hired and trained family counselors using a 7-phase model of family systems counseling. And we trained them, and together with communities, we started a referral network that brought youth who had demonstrated some negative behaviors, and we applied the tool with permission from their consenting adults. So once we did that, we worked with the National University to run the results. And based on those results, there were cut points at if you had 1 to 3 risk factors, you were considered primary. I'm sorry, 1 to 4, 5 to X, you were considered secondary, and then onward towards tertiary. And based on that, we determined eligibility. This is really important to understand that this was all consent driven with a very strong do no harm approach. So once we've done that, we go back to the communities, talk to the families, ask them if they're interested in increasing their resilience by receiving family counseling. So this wasn't directed at the youth per se, but at how we could create a family network, the family as protection network, so that they would receive the counseling. After the counsel, we also used the phases tool, which is a tool that measures family cohesion at the beginning, and then we apply it at the end. That tool was not applied to the child that was involved in the index youth. It was applied to a family member, and that was also applied at the end so we could create some measurement. So within these phased approaches, you stop midway, you kind of regroup and you say, okay, what has the family achieved with the family? And you do a family celebration. This is all done in a strategic team of 3 counselors, one who is the lead counselor in families' houses. So we're able to engage with them on their level. We worked with tertiary voluntarily identified as well. But we felt like those kids and youth needed a different level of intervention. So we shifted that in the 2nd through 4th cohorts of families that we worked with. In all, we worked over 4 years with 1,200 families. So in order to get to this level in identification, you have to apply this tool to, if you get 1,200 eligible youth, you have to apply the tool to about 4,000 kids, which gives you a sense of how to identify and then kind of figure out how to stratify a little bit youth. Next. So this is just a picture to show one of the things that we did really well was really brought the family together and identified through the use of various tools, one being what we call the genogram of our family tree, to look and identify how those relationships were built and how that power dynamic and relational dynamic changed over time. And this is just a picture of them using the genogram. Next. One of the other things we did was as the family would identify where that breakdown was, a lot of it was in not responding to responsibilities, not doing, household tasks. And so every family basically had the opportunity to create a calendar of what their expectations were. And every week, a counselor would come back and kind of review that with them. And the family was then responsible for assigning household tasks, and whether or not just household homework, and then creating a level of kind of recognition of that. Next. And so what worked and what didn't? Well, we had an organized and well-documented approach to family counseling and systems, and that we really felt like language was also really essential. And by that, I mean, you can't use the same language with an 8-year-old and an 8-year-old's family in the continuum of early childhood and childhood development. So we had to really understand that. And the recognition of a family as a system was really important. And we really understood that we needed to meet families where they are in their homes, what are their educational levels, etc. And one of the things we realized the first year was that we had this really great idea that everybody would do family counseling for 12 months. And we realized that risk levels didn't change much between 6 months and 12 months. So we shifted it to 6 months. And there was a shift in how government entities looked at youth from a risk differentiation standpoint. And there was a reduction of stigmatism of vulnerable populations. And there was a recognition of youth as valuable inside and outside the family. And then finally, we could reduce risk in the secondary population by 74%. That is to say that 74% of the youth that were engaged in family counseling over 4 years went from secondary risk to primary. Next. So what are the changes? We saw a risk differentiated approach is now part of language and programmatic approaches of government institutions, the Directorate of Protection of Youth, and the National Institute for the Attentions of Youth in Conflict with the Law. We really felt like juvenile justice judges made a significant shift to decrease the number of kids in detention based on their knowledge of the family systems. The IMC tool is being used by other CSOs with a broader population and have included questions that identify the risk to migrate and the role of protection factors. And families in counseling are being promoted through municipal prevention committees and other service providers. Next. The other thing that we felt was really important is we saw more engagement in the community, and that actually families were more engaged than they were before. And that was really building trust in the communities. And one of the aspects that we did was we did community family fairs. And that was done by a cadre of family promoters who were really just helping communities be system navigators. And that culminated again with service fairs and just fairs where not just people could celebrate, but also they could have access to justice and healthcare and things like that. And that really does build trust and resilience in communities.
Robyn, thank you. Victoria, could I just jump in for 1 second? I just had 2 quick follow-up questions, and we just want to remind people to please either put your questions in the chat or in the reactions little emoji down there. Please, if you want to raise your hand and ask a question. When David is finished, we're going to ask one question and then open it up to everybody. But along the way, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. I had just a couple of follow-up things. Is it possible that you can share any of the tools that you described, Robyn?
The tools, yes. So do you mean the IMC and the FACES tools? Is that what you meant?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the IMC tool is it measures kids' risks on a series of scales, and it's all self-reported. And it was designed, as I said before, by the University of Southern California to use in the GRID program in Los Angeles. And from that, it was brought here under the idea that, of course, if we just translate it, it will be great.
Right.
But clearly, we realized that it really needed to be contextualized. And that I just want to go back to that was contextualized for younger age group and for the populations that we worked in for Honduras. So it was really contextualized with Arizona State University and USC, but really with the cadre of family counselors. And so we determined that if kids were at a risk of, having the lowest risk that was determined by certain cut points, that you were within the risk of, there were 9 risk factors. So if you had 1 to 3 risks, you were considered primary. And those families were referred to the family promoters to just do follow-up, link them to services. If you were from 4 to 6, you were considered secondary and eligible for family counseling and also service access. If you were in 7 to 9, you were considered tertiary. And that was where we determined, there might be differences in approaches and how to do the counseling.
Okay.
Then we use the phases approach to measure family cohesion, the phases tool.
Okay, so are those public documents? Are those public things to be able to share?
They are documents, they're on the deck.
Oh, okay. So we can put them back up and make sure people or have a link to them and get people. Okay, that's great. So Victoria, there you go.
Thanks, Bonnie. And thank you very much, Robyn. That was That was an interesting presentation. I heard you say like looking at family as systems and also meeting families where they are at. I think those are very important things to remember. We also have another presenter with us here today, Daniel Okpaise. Daniel works with OneAfricanChild, and I will hand over now to Daniel to share more about systems therefore that is going on in Nigeria and with OneAfricanChild. Over to you, Daniel.
Hi everyone, good day. Thank you, Victoria. Before I go further, I would like to be thankful to what Robyn Braverman shared around how the family was a central part to pushing the system efforts. So I would like to go in Nigeria. So OneAfricanChild Foundation is a non-profit organization which works in the educational space, drive equality in education, but not just equality, but also access to equal educational opportunities. And a key way we have been doing this in the past 7 years has been through educators training. So how do we help the teachers get better? How do we get them educated on current learning styles? Because we believe that the education system should always be a honest one that offers every child a chance to be creative, every child a chance to train. And so it's been a big thing for us. And we have also looked at how can we carry out projects that also directly affect children around global citizenship, around definitely systems. And most importantly, a key part of what we have been doing has been to change the system of education rather than it having a disconnect between the different levels. How can we ensure that whatever a child learns at the basic form of the primary school education connects to they have at the secondary school and going forward? And to make this successful over the past few months, we have noticed that we need to constantly evolve, we need to constantly ensure that the system is effective, it's sustainable, it can be carried for years and years to come. And in the picture here, we have some of our volunteers. We are a youth-led organization, and we have a lot of young people who volunteer with us. And one of the biggest driving force for our organization are these. And this brings us to the youth systems project we are currently carrying out. We understand that young people are a key part of all we do. The population of Africa has 60% of it being young, and we are not just volunteering, but every part of their life requires a way of empowerment. So how can we get them to think outside the box? How can we get them to function better? And so we looked at how could we empower young people all over Nigeria, all over Kenya, and other parts of Africa to change their communities education-wise and building-wise. And to do this, we collaborated with Colombia and Let's Vision, which is led by Michaela Sebastian and Brand and Simon Jacobs. So also self-learning, organized learning environment is that it creates a distributed environment where there is no central teacher, no central leader for it, but rather we have a round table where everyone from the community comes in to have their voice heard in terms of how do we design a system that creates sustainability or solutions to problems that we have. Can we move on to the next slide?
Daniel, can you also speak a little bit louder?
Okay, thank you. Had already spoken to what we do and what we currently are. Our biggest goals, just as they are stated here, are systems change in terms of access and quality of education. But I also spoke to how we're trying to empower young people. So we know that as an organization, OneAfricanChild, we are limited in terms of geographically where we are. But how can we get every African youth, every Nigerian youth, every Kenyan youth to look at their community? How can they improve it? How can they make it better rather than relying on old systems? And this is where SOAP came. So SOAP gives us the ability to have various discussions, have various roundtable meetings in various committees without having to have a central director, who is centrally leading. So this doesn't mean that there's not a background to ensuring that the system works, but everyone in the community has a voice. So please, because I came to the next slide. So the sole approach, like I said, is a self-organizing environment, but a big thing about it is that we use big question approach. So a big question approach, for example, is one that I tried with the young people in Nigeria was, we asked a question around education. What would a honest education for you look like? And for everyone, that cuts across so many things, that both their experiences and where they currently are. And we had individuals sharing their experiences, talking about what they had gone through or what they expected their education, and probably how it had failed them or how it had not reached what they had expected or their expectations. But we didn't just want to stay at sharing ideas of, oh, this is how my education came, this is what I expected. But we also try to take them to an approach called design thinking. Firstly, asking the question, what's enhanced education for you? That was to introduce them to empathy. How do you think towards what experiences, the experiences of every African child out there in terms of education? But we notice that a lot of times when it comes to youth efforts, the ideation process and the sustainability processes are not, they are not systems that are being followed. And we try to guide them towards this by saying, how then could you create success, or how then can you create a honest education or a honest education? So not just saying, oh, what does a honest education look like for you, but how can we go about creating it? What would you call a successful education? And we had a lot of people sharing ideas, and we had 3 discussions over 2 months with over 18 individuals. And the idea was that after each discussion, another question for the next discussion, but the next discussion took off from the previous discussion in terms of whatever we were able to agree upon as regard, okay, what does success look like? And probably have to talk around maybe learning styles. Oh, I hope my education will have cater for everybody's learning styles, both abstract learners, both experiential learners, and others. And then we ask them, okay, what current systems or what current infrastructures do you have or do you think would have worked? And so we're able to get yes from their various communities. We're able to hear them even as regards peace building. And I think the peace building was also a very big one, because we got to understand that a lot of times think about peace as maybe during times of war, during times of conflict. But we were able to also, through using the big question approach, to explain that how do we go about understanding the proper functionality of your community in terms of inter-ethnic relationships, inter-religious relationships, inter-group relationships, which was a big thing for them to understand, because we believe that using the soul approach, if everyone's voice is not shared, is not heard before an intervention is created, it means that whatever intervention or system are being created will be one-sided. So a good example could be the educational system. You only get to hear from people who are probably attending, who are in well-to-do environments, who are doing well socioeconomically. It means that if we create interventions, those interventions we only cater for people in that sphere. But because it was a roundtable discussion whereby everyone from the community was brought to the table, every young person from the community, so every young lawyer, a young doctor, a young artisan, a young student, a young teacher, various people brought in. So it meant that as we discussed on how we could create systems that would work as regards how do we say peace in our communities, how do we improve our education in terms of access and quality, we could hear from a teacher, we could hear from a trader, we could hear from a doctor, and understand that, okay, if we are creating a roadmap for an intervention, it will cater for both an African who is coming from the home of a mom who is a doctor, or from a mom or who is a teacher, or from someone who's here to finish school. And the interventions reached out to everyone. And our roundtable discussion, like I said, were disruptive. Disruptive in that there was no central facilitator. What we had were moderators whose work or duties were, during the conversations, were to ask extra questions that probe deeper. So we didn't just rely on surface responses or I wish we could have ability, or I wish we could have better communication. Questions like, okay, what would communication look like in your own community, your own community of Ibadan, your own community of Lagos? How would you reach out to people in various religious sects? How would you reach out to traders? How would you bring traders to the table if you were to carry out an intervention as regards peace? How would you bring school students? How would you bring teachers? How would you bring professors? How would you bring everyone in your community to the table? So this pushed the conversation further, with people having to sit down and look at the various relationships in their community and look at central ideas, central beliefs, central spaces where everyone could come into and have the discussion. And we also had what we call the granny. So the role of a granny was to guide the facilitators before and after discussion, and also help them analyze responses so that it could help us create a better roadmap and a more effective roadmap. So the biggest outcome for what we're trying to do with the SOL approach was to ensure that these conversations were not just conversations, but they were able to allow us to create a roadmap for every young person out there who has an idea, who notices an issue as regards education, as regards peace building in their countries. How can they start? Where do they start from? Because we know one of the greatest tools creativity and innovation, but they might lack the tools to sustain that or to deliver it across their various communities. So we looked at how could we create a map that would allow every young person across Africa to look at an issue in their community, bring people to the conversation table from their community, and also then design an intervention based on the conversation that they have. And not just for the young people, but for us as an organization going forward, every project, every intervention we try to carry out, how can we integrate the SOL approach in ensuring that the project we deliver has the voices, has the giving or approach of everyone within the community or whatever community we're going to, rather than just bringing our own ideas, our own interventions. How could we make it indigenous communities? How could we make it more effective? And thereby disrupting the previous system of just bringing our own intervention or a young person thinking about a solution and just going with it without empathizing, ideating, and seeing how they could deploy that in their own community. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Go ahead, Victoria.
Thank you, Daniel, for such a succinct presentation. You shared about what OneAfricanChild has been doing with Seoul, Colombia, and also having working with OneAfricanChild as well. I know a little bit more about what you've just presented. I can see one question in the chat function, and I'd like to encourage others to please ask questions to Robyn and Daniel based on the presentation that you've heard today. But maybe I can ask you, Daniel, as a young person, you know, working in education, working in development, obviously you've seen that it's not easy to design programs. And how do you think that system change efforts or having the lens of a systems thinker has influenced the work that you do? You've described going through all of these processes with Seoul, Colombia. Do you think that there are some significant changes that is being reflected in the work that OneAfricanChild is doing, or to you personally with all the other projects that you're involved in?
Thank you, Victor. So I noticed that as regards projects or interventions that we carry out as an organization or even as an individual, a lot of times we have a premeditated idea as regards either the community, the pool, or whoever we're trying to have these programs object with. And so this meant that in the initial phase, the project delivery could success, but sustaining it over time with those communities might become an issue because certain idiosyncrasies or certain things about that were not taken into context before the project was created. So we probably got to hear from teachers in the communities, for example, like a community like Akwa Bay, we got to hear from the children and their parents. But we probably didn't get to hear from the community leaders. We didn't get to hear from people who have previously stayed in that community or led that community. And so if with the sole idea, the sole approach, getting to speak with people, everyone in that community, yes, we can't gather everybody physically in the community, but we could have representative individuals from each of that community. Them as regards, this is what we're trying to do. What do you think works, or what's your own experience as regards? So hearing from them means that we can tailor those programs, and also it means that we also get feedback. We can see potential roadblocks, potential issues, and this means that we can sustain it, and it's never, it doesn't get out after a while.
Thanks, Daniel. If I can reframe what you just said, it's important for us to constantly reflect on, who are the stakeholders that are involved in the projects that we are working on and whose voice is missing out. Yeah, so I really appreciate you sharing that. There's another question for you, and there's also one question for Robyn. So I'll ask this next question to you, and then also ask the question to Robyn from Chelsea. Someone is asking, how are the facilitators selected? You shared a lot about this project is based on, having dialogues, bringing young people together to talk about issues that affect them and their educators. Education, and that the people who lead these are facilitators. So how are these facilitators selected for the projects that we've done?
So because this project was a pilot project, so the first thing we did was to look at communities who had previously worked in or worked with, and looked at young individuals who we had worked with, volunteers, young community leaders. And so we firstly had a roundtable with them, sharing what we wanted to do, and then a call was put out for facilitators. And so we didn't just bring the facilitators in, we had above a month where we trained them, explained to them, so that we ensured that they had to understand that this was not just any kind of training where you were coming to deliver, but rather you were coming to moderate, to guide conversations between people in your community, rather than being the central piece of that conversation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for sharing that, Daniel. Again, I heard you say that facilitators are just there to guide the discussion and to, pull the pieces together. They are not really there to teach. Thanks for sharing. So I'll go back to Robyn. There's a question for you, Robyn. It's from Chelsea, and she said she would be interested to hear about the differences in the effects of the intervention activities that you talked about by age segment.
Thank you for that. Well, obviously, if what we found, first of all, Chelsea and others on this call, is that, when we applied the IMC tool, that we had to kind of shift language and have a deeper understanding of where kids were in that childhood development framework in order to ensure that there wasn't kind of a one recipe approach. I mean, if you look at systems and family systems, everything is kind of do this, do that. But it was the way that we trained our counselors to really look at how you shift that language, how you look at the differentiation in kids' roles in the household, And one of the other things that I wanted to mention is that we really tried to really encourage kind of more equitable gender roles as well, particularly because mothers would complain about daughters ignoring them and not sweeping the floor, and but the boys weren't sweeping the floor. This is just kind of a generic example. So that's one way that we did it. The system remained the same. It was the language approach and how we really applied that language and our own understanding of where children and youth, children were in that development spectrum. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, that I found that helpful. And I think that if we look at the framework, we're talking about some of the norms and mindsets angle, because language is very much a part of making systems change. We've had certain language about, from a youth development perspective over the last 50, 80 years about trying to fix young people all the time. And we're trying to like reframe that language into identifying sort of their strengths and assets and building on them so that we get more of the positive, which over time would reduce, you know, some of the negative. There's a whole shift in norms and mindsets with then influence, we hope, policy, and then services and resources and budgets and everything that's in here. So I think that's a really key part. We wanted to just ask a quick question to both of you about a particular looking at the framework, if you could pick a piece of it and tell us where you've had either a success or there's been a challenge in making a change at the systems level in the countries that you've been working in, related to the work you've been doing. So I'll start with whoever, you know, maybe Robyn, you want to go first?
Yeah, happy. That's a big question. Well, first of all, let's frame this in the context of a 4-year program and what you can be really realistic about in terms of really those system changes at an institutional level. That being said, I think we had a lot of success with the juvenile justice sector in kind of reframing again how many kids how judges looked at adjudicating sentences from immediate detention to a different framework, and how they're using that family lens to look at kids in conflict with the law. I think that's one. I think the other one is norms and mindsets. One of the things, and I don't think it's just our program, I think it's the collective of place-based programs that really help to destigmatize youth and families from these high crime areas. I think it's still an issue, but I think those norms and mindsets have certainly changed from the private sector, from institutions, from previously having a complete fear and this complete kind of decontextualized idea about what these kids were like and not giving them access to services or jobs because you came from X community, to really being kind of more inclusive, to the point where there is more engagement in these communities. And finally, I would say, just norms and mindsets from the kids and their relationships to co-responsibility within their family, and really embracing that family has become a protective factor. I would say, again, resource flows, not so much. I think we have to, that would require a longer project investment. And then finally, I think one of the things that we were talking about was services have become broader and more inclusive over time, but non-governmental services. I think the final piece is that there is a better linkages where there had been dissension between CSOs and government around services and roles and responsibilities towards youth at risk.
And just one quick follow-up question. You said it a couple of times about promotive factors and protective factors. Is there just a quick explanation you can do of those, if that's the right language you're using?
I use protective factors because I think kids didn't feel protected inside their communities and inside their families. So what are we looking at? We're looking at whether family cohesion can really create that, where they feel a sense of belonging and safety.
Okay.
And they started to really increase that within their family and also within their schools. And I just want to say one more thing. And one of the things that we did was, obviously, we did a very intense quantitative analysis about whether this worked. We did a qualitative analysis as well, where we went back and looked at the four cohorts over the year of the 4 years of intervention to see whether they had indeed continued to shift these behaviors. And that actually was effective. And then finally, we did a very exhaustive cost-benefit analysis of the family counseling program to really use the evidence to show that the investment was worth the outcome.
Okay. Danielle, we're going to get to you, but there's one quick question that Ayobami Adesian asked. Sorry if I really didn't say your name right, but what role does the economic status of these families predict the success of the ICM framework?
Are you talking to me about
Yes,
the
yes,
IMC?
Rob.
Oh, okay, sorry.
ICM, yeah, IMC framework, right. So what role does the economic status of these families predict the success?
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, obviously, we're working in communities that are considered highly vulnerable. I would say they're working class or living in poverty. And I would say that obviously what's going to impact that success is creating that structure and system around them and providing access to services. And one of the things that we realized is that, and that includes employment, right? And so one of the things that we did, because we realized there was a lack, is we created a website that is a geo-referenced website for all kinds of services. And we worked with other implementers to really roll this out. And that was one of the, I would say, the biggest challenges, because it didn't end up being rolled out, but we transferred it to somebody else so that you can call it up on your phone and say, where can I get access to youth employment information or things like that. So that's also really helping. So I would say, obviously, destigmatizing the economic status of somebody certainly helps them to become more active and have more self-esteem in their communities.
Okay, thank you. Danielle, also, so quickly looking at the framework, is there some success or challenge in terms of getting the work that you've been doing via SOL to the systems level?
One of the biggest challenges was around norms and mindset. A big thing we're trying to do was inclusiveness of the various communities in terms of any project or programs that was going to be delivered to those communities. And so a lot of times the system works whereby stakeholders in courts of the various communities look at the issues and then pass it across to leaders or people who are representing those communities. But we found that a good amount of times these stakeholders were not resident in the communities or were aloof of the experiences of those communities. So this meant that whatever project or programs were being brought by these systems, either education, peace building, religious, or any other system in those communities, was not effective enough or didn't cater for everyone. And most of these communities had taken up that mindset that whatever the leaders or whatever the stakeholders decided upon is probably what we have to work on, even if it was not catering to their needs or whatever they wanted. So a big thing for us was to get everyone to the table, firstly with the idea that your idea, your experience is important in any project as regards education or peace building that we will be sharing. And so when people were sharing ideas in the first conversation, when we asked them how an honest education would look like in our communities, people most likely were talking around accountability, talking around leaders, around improper communication between their leaders. And so we had to ask them, what does communication look like for you, even within your own community, across how do you communicate with people in various religious sects? How do you communicate with someone who is from a different tribal group within your community as regards peace, as regards how do you maintain peace? So we had to work changing the mindset. And as the conversations went on, by the third conversation, we found that people were no longer talking about, oh, we needed leaders to do this, but they're talking about how could I effectively communicate better with someone from another sect, from another group, from another tribe, and ensure that we can work together. People were beginning to suggest common places, common meeting spots, common goals that they had across religious groups that they could use as central points to come together and then have conversations as regards improving that community, as regards making it better. So the norms and minds were a big thing for us because we believe whatever framework, whatever roadmap we create, if people still don't believe that they can be included or they have a role to play in those frameworks, then it will not be effective.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we're coming down to the end. I don't see any more questions in the chat or any little hands raised. So we can go on to the next slide. And I just want to thank both Danielle and Robyn. You know, part of the goal of the youth system strengthening community of practice is to look at what's going on in different countries from different contexts and different sectors about the you know, the work we're doing to change at the systems level. It's very hard work. It does not happen overnight. We're talking about probably 10s and 20s of years to really make the changes. But if we don't start and we don't pay attention and we don't measure and we don't, you know, talk about that level of work, then a lot of our projects will continue to just be one-off and not making and not rolling up to the type of change we want to see at the systems level. So both Robyn and Daniel, you're doing great work and we appreciate learning from both of you and the role of young people in Nigeria and bringing them together and the role of, family systems in Honduras. These were, are things that we need to learn more about. So we just want to remind people to please join us on youthpower.org, and that's the way to join. You can come in, you can see more of the things that we've been posting and learn more about some of the other communities of practice. And we will present our last, for this fiscal year, our last event will be in September, and we will be bringing together some donors who will talk about why they are supporting systems change efforts and what they're learning from that and where they hope to go in the future with this work. So Victoria, I don't know if you want to say anything else, but I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you so much to our presenters for the time and energy they put into this and what we learned today.
Thank you so much to our two presenters, Robyn and Daniel. You both did a fantastic job laying out more of what system strengthening is about and what the goals and objective of our community of practice really is about. But I also want to say thank you to everyone who connected here today. Thank you for asking questions to our presenters and for sharing resources with us as well. Looking forward to seeing you in September.
Yes, and I never want to forget that we need to thank our, the staff that helps put all this together. Katie and Whitney and Katie and Judith, and there's a lot of background work that gets put together to do these and have the PowerPoints and organize all of this and get the invitations out. So thank you to everybody.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, we'll see you hopefully next month.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.